Get out before I call the police." The female bank manager didn't just reject the check, she slammed her hand down on the counter, snatched the $5 million draft, and tore it in half on the spot. She threw the torn pieces straight into the face of the large, overweight man. His 8-year-old daughter flinched. The entire bank lobby fell into a chilling silence. Security personnel began moving closer, yet Nathan didn't flinch and he didn't raise his voice. What the female manager had no idea was that in less than 2 hours, the legal ownership of the entire bank would be placed directly into the hands of the very man she had just humiliated. She believed she was throwing out a homeless con artist. In reality, she had just torn up the check belonging to the bank's new owner right in front of his child. Here's the thing, Nathan never walked into that bank intending to prove who he was. Because that morning the only thing he cared about was making sure his daughter had a decent lunch to take to school. At 4:58 a.m., Nathan Reed was already awake in his quiet suburban kitchen. Ever since his wife passed away 4 years ago, he had chosen to work entirely from home as an independent private investor, managing his portfolio from a home office so he could be fully present for every moment of his 8-year-old daughter's life. The room smelled of cold brew coffee and fresh toast. He stood at the wooden kitchen counter in his thick cotton socks, his broad shoulders hunched over a brown paper lunch bag, holding a black Sharpie in his thick fingers. With careful, steady strokes, he drew a lopsided smiley face right on the front of the paper. It was a silent, gentle ritual he had performed every single morning since Grace started kindergarten. At 6:15 a.m., Grace shuffled into the kitchen, her hair messy from sleep and her blue canvas backpack slung over one arm. She glanced at the brown bag on the counter, picked it up and tucked it into the front pouch of her pack without saying a word. That was her quiet way of saying thank you. Nathan wiped down the counter with a damp yellow cloth. On his laptop screen by the sink, a calendar notification popped up, reminding him that he had rescheduled all his afternoon virtual client calls. In the notes section, he had typed one phrase, "in-person closing appointment." Grace tilted her head, watching him cap the black marker with a soft click. "Dad, the mouth is crooked." Nathan smiled gently, his broad thumb tracing the edge of the counter. "It's a crooked smile, like mine." Grace didn't argue. She just zipped her backpack and stood quietly by the front door. On the kitchen table, sitting right next to his car keys, lay a thick white envelope containing the legal documents that would change their lives forever by 3 o'clock that afternoon. The midnight blue Subaru Outback hummed quietly as Nathan backed out of the driveway and onto the tree-lined suburban street. It was a practical, well-maintained family vehicle, comfortable, reliable, and chosen specifically for safety rather than status. Grace sat in the front passenger seat, adjusting the air vents with her small fingers, enjoying the calm, silent rhythm of their morning commute. As they drove past the town's public library, Grace rested her chin on her hand, watching the sunlight play across the brick building. "Where are you going today, Dad?" Nathan kept his large, steady hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. "The bank, then pickup." Grace looked over at his faded navy polo shirt, the exact same comfortable shirt he wore while working at home, attending school meetings, or running weekend errands. "Why the bank? To make a deposit." Grace turned her head, her dark eyebrows knitting together in curiosity. "How much?" Nathan paused at a red light, catching her reflection in the rearview mirror with a subtle, warm glint in his eyes. "Enough to buy that library over there if you wanted it." Grace let out a soft laugh and shook her head, turning back to the window, assuming it was just another one of her dad's affectionate jokes. When he pulled into the school drop-off lane, Nathan reached into his pocket and tucked a folded $2 bill into the mesh side pocket of her backpack, a quiet daily gesture just in case she wanted a juice at lunch. Grace adjusted her backpack straps and smiled through the open passenger window. "Are you picking me up after school, Dad?" Nathan nodded, reaching across to gently pat her shoulder. "Right at 3:30. We'll go straight to the library." After dropping Grace off at school, Nathan spent the morning working in his home office, wrapping up his client calls before heading downtown after lunch. At 1:45 p.m., he parked his Subaru in a quiet municipal lot 2 blocks down the street. It wasn't about saving a few dollars on parking, it was his personal preference for a quiet, 2-minute walk to clear his mind before a major transaction, away from the noise and pretense of downtown business traffic. He sat in the quiet cabin for a moment, looking through the windshield at the sleek stone and glass facade of Meridian Bank's Eastfield branch. From the glove compartment, he pulled out the heavy white envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $5 million, alongside a full set of corporate acquisition agreements signed by all 4 board members. On the line marked transferee, printed in bold black typography, was his full name, Nathan Reed. Effective at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the keys, the physical building, and the entire financial operations of Meridian Bank belonged to him. Nathan folded the documents with deliberate care, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it inside the chest pocket of his polo shirt, right over his heart. He smoothed his khaki trousers and glanced in the rearview mirror. He wasn't wearing a $1,000 tailored suit, nor did he carry a flashy leather briefcase. Because he worked independently from home, he dressed for comfort and authenticity, believing that real substance mattered far more than corporate attire. He checked his watch, 1:45 p.m. Taking a calm, deep breath, he opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. 10 minutes, he murmured to himself as his New Balance sneakers hit the pavement. 10 minutes, then the library. Nathan pushed open the heavy glass door of Meridian Bank's Eastfield branch. The lobby was quiet, brightly lit, and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and crisp paper currency. 3 tellers sat behind the polished oak counter, but not a single one raised their head or called out a welcome as he stepped inside. Standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing over 300 pounds, Nathan's heavy, obese frame naturally drew quiet, judgmental glances from the staff, his faded navy polo stretching tight across his broad shoulders and heavy midsection. Nathan pulled a small white paper slip from the automated ticket dispenser near the glass entrance and stood quietly near the velvet stanchions. 3 full minutes passed. A man wearing a tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes walked in behind him. Immediately, the teller closest to the door looked up, smiled warmly, and beckoned the suited man forward without requiring a ticket. Nathan watched the encounter, his face completely expressionless, saying nothing. Subtle prejudice based on his weight and casual appearance was an old acquaintance he had encountered many times throughout his life, and he had learned long ago not to let it ruin his peace. When his ticket number finally flashed on the digital wall display, Nathan stepped up to counter 1. He reached into his polo shirt chest pocket, retrieved the heavy white envelope, and placed the $5 million cashier's check flat on the granite counter. Rachel, a young teller with tired eyes and a silver name tag, scanned the check into her terminal. Suddenly, a bright amber warning banner flashed across her screen, verification service temporarily unavailable, unable to retrieve issuing bank data. Rachel cleared her throat nervously, looking up from the screen to scan Nathan's towering, heavyset build. "I'd like to deposit this into my account," Nathan said softly. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low. "Looks like the verification network is down. Let me get my manager." Diane walked out from her corner office with quick, sharp footsteps that echoed across the marble floor. She was a middle-aged branch manager with immaculately styled hair, sharp lipstick, and a cold, calculating gaze. She glanced at the amber warning banner on Rachel's computer screen, picked up the cashier's check, and then slowly raised her eyes to scan Nathan from head to toe. Her eyes lingered disapprovingly on his large, obese frame, his heavy stomach pressing against his faded polo shirt, his plain khaki trousers, and his worn New Balance sneakers. She made no effort whatsoever to conceal her disgust and skepticism. Someone carrying a $5 million check doesn't usually walk in dressed like that, or looking like that when the system can't verify it, Diane declared, her voice deliberate and loud enough to carry across the quiet lobby. Nathan didn't flinch. With quiet precision, he reached back into his envelope and placed 3 neat documents side by side on the granite counter: his state driver's license, his bank debit card, and the official stock transfer confirmation sheet, complete with the issuing institution's direct verification hotline, printed clearly at the top. On Diane's computer monitor behind the counter, an open browser tab displayed an internal corporate memo detailing strict monthly KPI quotas for flagging high-value transactions following last week's regional compliance scandal. Rachel leaned in slightly, whispering to Diane, "The verification network is down. We should call the issuing bank directly using the number on his sheet." Diane shook her head dismissively, ignoring both the legal documents and her teller's suggestion. "Anyone can print out a piece of paper with a phone number," Diane stated coldly. Nathan looked straight into her eyes, his broad face calm and steady. "Call the verification number. I left it right there." Instead of dialing the issuing institution's direct hotline printed on the confirmation sheet, Diane picked up the gray internal telephone receiver mounted on the wall behind counter 1. She pressed a single speed dial button with her manicured fingernail. "I need immediate support at counter 1, she said into the receiver, her tone sharp and filled with urgent authority. "We have an oversized individual attempting a highly suspicious high-value deposit while the verification system is offline." Nathan didn't raise his voice, nor did he argue. Instead, he placed both of his broad, calloused hands flat on the granite counter, palms turned upward in a clear, open gesture, a calm habit he had learned years ago to show everyone in the room that despite his massive, intimidating size, he posed no physical threat whatsoever. In the waiting area behind him, 2 seated customers turned their heads. One man in a trench coat reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone, his screen lighting up as he prepared to record a video if things escalated. Nathan recognized that look immediately, the passive curiosity of bystanders waiting for a public spectacle involving a large man to unfold. Rachel looked up at Nathan, her mouth opening slightly as if she wanted to remind Diane to try the manual phone call. But under Diane's stern, warning glare, she closed her mouth and looked back down at her keyboard in complete silence. "You haven't called the verification number," Nathan stated quietly, his gaze fixed on the branch manager. Diane set the gray receiver back onto its cradle without answering him. A second later, the side office door clicked open and D. Kowalski, a part-time security guard wearing a gray uniform shirt and a heavy plastic name badge, stepped out into the lobby. D. Kowalski's heavy, rubber-soled boots thudded softly against the polished marble floor as he walked over to counter 1. He was a seasoned part-time security guard in his late 50s who had worked at Meridian Bank's Eastfield branch for 6 long years. He looked at Nathan's faded navy polo shirt and broad frame, then turned his gaze toward Diane's agitated face behind the counter. Kowalski knew Diane extremely well. He knew she was constantly under intense corporate pressure from headquarters to hit her compliance KPIs, and he had personally witnessed her trigger false security alarms more than once over trivial misunderstandings with regular customers. "What seems to be the problem here, sir?" Kowalski asked, keeping his voice measured, polite, and professional as he approached the counter. Nathan didn't step back or flinch. "I am waiting for the branch manager to dial the direct verification phone number printed right here on my stock transfer confirmation document." Diane immediately cut in, her voice shrill, sharp, and laced with unyielding authority. "There's nothing to explain or discuss, Kowalski. The automated verification system flagged this transaction, and he is attempting to deposit a fraudulent check for $5 million. Under standard branch compliance protocol, we are seizing this paper draft as evidence of attempted fraud." Diane reached her manicured hand far across the granite counter, aiming straight for the paper draft. Nathan calmly slid the cashier's check back half an inch under his broad, heavy palm, keeping it firmly secured just out of her reach. "Keep him right here, officer," Diane ordered loudly, completely ignoring Nathan's quiet composure. "Sir, please cooperate with us," Kowalski said softly, though his hand drifted ominously closer to his leather utility belt. Nathan placed the flat of his heavy, calloused palm firmly over the cashier's check on the granite counter. "This check is my legal personal property," he said, his voice dropping into a deep, resonant calm that commanded instant silence across the entire bank lobby. "You have no legal authority to confiscate funds or my legal documents without placing the verification call first." Diane sneered with open contempt, pointing her finger aggressively at Rachel's computer monitor. "The system has already flagged it as suspicious, and that gives me all the authority I need. If you believe a father should never have his dignity questioned, simply because he chooses an unpretentious life, consider subscribing to follow Nathan's story as the truth unfolds." Kowalski stared intently at Nathan's massive, unmoving hand resting motionless over the check. He noticed that despite the large man's obese build and the rising tension in the lobby, Nathan wasn't shaking, nor was he displaying a single sign of guilt, nervousness, or panic. Nathan's eyes were terrifyingly still, filled with a deep, unshakable clarity that made the experienced guard hesitate in his tracks. Kowalski took a quiet, heavy breath, realizing that forcing this massive man physically would cause an immediate public spectacle in front of all the waiting customers. Rachel leaned forward once more, her throat working as her lips parted to speak up in Nathan's defense and suggest calling the hotline again. But before she could utter a single word, Diane whipped her head around, glaring at the young teller with sharp, intimidating hostility. "Rachel, keep quiet and stick to your keyboard," Diane snapped venomously. Kowalski took a cautious step forward, his thick fingers unfastening the leather snap of his sidearm holster with a quiet, ominous metallic click. The crisp metallic snap of Kowalski's holster echoed ominously through the quiet bank lobby. He took another step closer, his hand resting firmly on the handle of his sidearm. "Sir, I must ask you to keep your hands where I can see them and do not make any sudden moves." Nathan didn't back down a single inch. Standing well over 6 feet tall with his broad, heavy-set shoulders, his massive physical presence completely shielded the counter space behind him. Sensing an opportunity while Nathan was focused on the guard, Diane reached all the way across the oak counter and snatched the $5 million check right out of Rachel's trembling fingers. Nathan didn't grab it back, knowing that a physical struggle over fragile paper would only tear the legal draft in front of the bystanders currently recording on their smartphones. Diane held the $5 million check high above her head like a victorious trophy. "I am calling 911 right now," she declared loudly, keying in 3 quick digits on the wall phone behind the counter. "The police will be here in 3 minutes, and you will be handcuffed and arrested for attempting bank fraud." Nathan looked directly at Diane, his broad face completely unreadable. Then he turned his wrist slightly to check his watch, 2:10 p.m. In exactly 1 hour and 20 minutes, Grace would be standing by the school drop-off gates waiting for him. He could not afford to be detained in a police precinct today. "You are making a very serious mistake, manager," Nathan said softly, his deep voice cutting through the heavy tension across the room. At 2:48 p.m., the heavy glass entrance doors swept open once more, and the soft chime echoed across the silent, suffocating lobby. 8-year-old Grace stepped inside, carrying her faded blue canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, her dark hair tied in a slightly messy ponytail. She had been dropped off outside by a classmate's mother according to the exact plan Nathan had texted earlier that morning. Grace stopped right at the threshold, her small canvas shoes motionless as her perceptive, observant eyes scanned the crowded, tense room. She immediately picked up on the unnatural atmosphere, seeing her father standing motionless at counter one with an armed security guard hovering right behind his shoulder. Instead of running forward in panic or crying, Grace stood her ground calmly, reading the room with a quiet maturity far beyond her years. Her small hand tightened slightly around the strap of her backpack as she took 2 hesitant steps forward, her eyes never leaving her father's face. Nathan turned his head slightly and caught his daughter's eye across the wide marble floor. For a split second, he wished she were anywhere else in the world but inside this bank. But she was already here, watching her father being surrounded by hostile glances. Diane glanced over at Grace, scanning her worn backpack and simple canvas sneakers, then looked back at Nathan with a cold, mocking smirk. "Is this child with you?" Diane asked, her voice dropping into a razor-thin sneer as if a fresh piece of incriminating evidence had just walked through the door. "Dad, why is everyone looking at you like that?" Grace asked softly, her voice clear and steady. Nathan held out his broad hand toward her. "Come stand with me." Grace walked over quietly and stood right beside her father, her small hand reaching out to touch the side of his khaki trousers. Diane picked up the $5 million cashier's check from the granite counter for the very first time. She didn't bother to read the legal text or check the official verification hotline printed at the top of the paper. She glanced carelessly at the multi-million-dollar figure, then looked down at Grace's worn sneakers and Nathan's faded navy polo shirt and broad build. "Bringing your daughter along to play the sympathy card won't bypass bank enforcement protocol, sir," Diane declared loudly, raising her voice so that every customer holding a smartphone could hear her rationale. Nathan looked straight into Diane's eyes, his voice dropping into a slow, deliberate rhythm like a man saying for the 10th time what he had already stated 9 times before. "You have 3 minutes," Nathan said quietly, his deep voice commanding stillness. "That's all it takes to place the verification call." Diane sneered with open contempt, glancing at the smartphones recording her from across the lobby. She didn't look at the check long enough to realize its true legal validity. With a sharp, aggressive movement of her manicured hands, she gripped both edges and ripped the $5 million cashier's check completely in half, right before everyone's eyes. The harsh, tearing sound of thick security paper echoed through the dead-silent lobby like a gunshot. Rachel gasped loudly behind the counter, covering her mouth in terror. Kowalski froze motionless, Diane tossed the two torn fragments into the air, letting them flutter down onto the marble floor. You can take these scraps to the police precinct and explain your $5 million fantasy to the officers, Diane spat coldly. One of the torn fragments of the $5 million cashier's check fluttered down through the still air and landed right against the toe of Grace's small canvas shoe. Sensing the open insult to her father, Grace began to bend down to pick up the paper draft for him. But before her fingers could touch the cold marble floor, Nathan placed his heavy, gentle hand firmly on her shoulder. "No need," Nathan said softly, his voice calm, steady, and unshakable. Grace stood back up straight, clutching her paper lunch bag tightly against her chest with both hands. Inside that crumpled brown paper bag was the untouched lunch he had packed at 4:58 that morning, the black Sharpie smiley face now slightly distorted across the creased paper. Kowalski stood right behind Nathan, but his hand slowly backed away from his leather holster. The seasoned guard looked down at the torn legal draft resting on the marble floor, looked at Grace's quiet face, and then turned his eyes away in silent shame. Nathan looked directly at Diane. For the first time all afternoon, something in the branch manager's eyes changed. It wasn't confidence, nor was it remorse. It was the sudden, hollow emptiness of a person who had just committed an irreversible act in front of a room full of witnesses. "Are you okay, Dad?" Grace whispered, looking up at his broad, reassuring face. Nathan looked down at his daughter, his steady eyes filled with unconditional warmth. "I'm fine," Nathan murmured softly, gently patting her shoulder. "Just stay close to me." Diane turned around abruptly and walked over to the gray wall telephone, keying in an outside line to call 911. 3 minutes later, the sharp, heavy thud of police boots echoed across the marble floor as two Eastfield police officers walked through the heavy glass entrance doors. They didn't rush in with drawn weapons, keeping a measured, professional pace as they scanned the silent lobby. The heavy atmosphere in the bank lobby grew even tighter as the two officers stepped closer to the counter. Diane immediately stepped out from behind counter one with aggressive, hurried steps, pointing her manicured finger directly at Nathan's broad frame. "Fraudulent check, refused to leave, possible security threat," she announced rapidly to the officers, throwing out 3 crisp corporate buzzwords, not a single one of which was entirely true. Nathan remained completely motionless where he stood, his large hands hanging loosely at his sides with his open palms, turned outward in a clear, non-threatening gesture he had maintained from the beginning. Grace stood pressed close to his side, looking up at the two uniformed officers the way an 8-year-old child looks at adults when trying to discern who is telling the truth. Kowalski stepped up beside Nathan, placing his broad hand very gently on the back of Nathan's navy polo shirt so lightly that a single step forward would brush it off. "Sir, let's step outside first, and we can sort everything out peacefully," Kowalski murmured in a low, quiet voice, offering the suggestion of a man who clearly hated what he was being ordered to do. The senior police officer took a slow step forward, looking closely at Kowalski's posture before addressing Nathan, then looked down at Grace holding her paper lunch bag tightly. "Sir, can you step outside with us?" the senior officer asked politely. Nathan looked straight into the officer's eyes. "Yes, but I'd like to make an official statement first." Before the senior officer could respond to Nathan's request, Grace turned her body around and looked directly out at the crowded lobby, her small hand releasing her father's trousers. Her young voice didn't shake, nor did she shed a single tear. She spoke loudly and clearly enough for her words to cut through every corner of the silent bank. "Why isn't anyone saying anything?" Grace asked, her perceptive, observant eyes scanning the crowd of standing adults. "You're all recording on your phones, but nobody's saying a word?" The quiet accusation in her voice echoed off the polished granite counter, making several waiting customers shift uncomfortably where they stood. The entire bank lobby froze into an absolute unbroken stillness. The seated customer holding his smartphone didn't lower his device, but his fingers stiffened visibly on the screen. The man in the trench coat looked down at his polished leather shoes, completely avoiding her innocent gaze. A woman recording near the velvet stanchions paused her camera for a single, hesitant second, then resumed recording, but not a single adult in the room could meet the 8-year-old girl's eyes. Nathan looked down at his daughter, realizing with a heavy heart that Grace was absorbing a painful, permanent lesson about human nature and bystander apathy, a moral burden far heavier than any torn $5 million check. He gently placed his heavy hand on Grace's shoulder, remaining silent. The younger police officer looked down at Grace, then turned his head to exchange a quiet, calculating glance with his senior partner, realizing the situation at Counter One was far more complicated than a simple bank fraud call. The harsh scrape of wooden chair legs sliding back shattered the heavy silence behind Counter One. Rachel stood up from her teller desk without asking for permission or waiting for an order. She walked out from behind the oak counter and stepped directly between the branch manager and the senior police officer. "I am the head teller at this counter," Rachel declared, her voice firm and resolute despite her pale face. This customer provided full legal state identification and valid financial documents. I requested to place a manual verification call twice, and both times I was cut off and ordered to stop by my manager. Diane took a sharp, aggressive step toward Rachel, her eyes flashing with venomous threat. "Rachel, do you have any idea what you're doing to your career at this bank?" The senior police officer immediately raised his gloved hand, holding it up firmly between Diane and the young teller without physically touching her. "Give us 1 minute, manager," the officer said sternly. "Go ahead, ma'am. Continue." Rachel pulled out a small piece of scratch paper from her apron pocket and read off the exact transaction details: Nathan's verified account number, the issuing bank's direct verification hotline, and the exact timestamps of Diane's refusal. Rachel didn't glance back at Diane once while speaking, her hands steady as she held the piece of paper before the police. The senior officer nodded approvingly, gesturing for his partner to record every detail. The junior officer immediately pulled out his official notepad and began writing down every single word. "If you were standing in Nathan's shoes right now, would you quietly walk out with the officers or stay and stand your ground? Comment your thoughts below." At 3:00 p.m., the heavy glass entrance doors swept open once more, and Gerald Holt stepped into the main lobby. The 62-year-old outgoing chief executive officer of Meridian Bank carried a worn black leather briefcase in his left hand, while his right hand slid a smartphone into his tailored charcoal gray suit pocket. Gerald was a seasoned financial executive who had managed the bank's operations for over 30 years and was known across the district for never being late to a single business meeting. He had arrived for his scheduled 3:00 p.m. closing appointment to sign the final M&A transfer documents with the institution's new owner. Gerald walked across the threshold, his polished leather shoes making crisp, rhythmic sounds against the stone floor. He had expected to meet a wealthy private investor in a private conference room, not a scene of confrontation. As he walked inside, Gerald immediately sensed an unnatural, heavy stillness hanging over the lobby. He saw 2 uniformed police officers standing near Counter One, an obese man in a faded navy polo shirt standing motionless with his open hands turned outward at his sides, an 8-year-old girl clutching a brown paper lunch bag, and 2 torn fragments of white security paper lying on the cold marble floor. Gerald's sharp, experienced eyes caught the torn paper on the ground before he even raised his eyes to the man's face. Then he raised his gaze and looked directly at Nathan's calm, broad features. Gerald stopped dead in his tracks. His heavy leather briefcase swung forward once with momentum, then froze completely still in his grip. "Oh no," Gerald whispered softly under his breath, all color instantly draining from his face as a wave of horror washed over him. Gerald walked briskly across the marble floor, stepping directly up to Counter One. He looked at Officer Kowalski, just a single, sharp, authoritative look, and the guard immediately dropped his hand away from Nathan's back and stepped 2 paces backward in silent retreat. Gerald turned to face the senior police officer. "I am Gerald Holt, the outgoing chief executive officer of Meridian Bank," Gerald announced, his voice tight and trembling with suppressed panic. "This man is Nathan Reed, the new sole owner of this entire bank, under a binding corporate acquisition agreement effective as of 3 o'clock today." Gerald unzipped his briefcase with trembling hands, pulled out an official bound set of M&A transfer documents, and placed them flat on the granite counter right next to the spot where the cashier's check had been torn in half. Printed clearly in bold black typography on the line marked Acquiring Party was the name Nathan Reed. Below it were the official legal seals and signatures of all 4 board members, time-stamped 3:00 p.m. exactly 2 minutes ago. Gerald's voice cut through the stillness like a heavy bell, leaving no doubt about the authenticity of the legal documents laid out before the police and bystanders. Gerald turned his head slowly and fixed a cold, horrified glare on Diane. "That's the man you just handed the keys to," Gerald said, his voice shaking with utter disbelief and rage. You tore up a check belonging to your new boss. An absolute breathless silence paralyzed the entire bank lobby. Diane stared at Gerald, then looked down at the official legal documents resting on the counter, and finally at the two torn fragments lying on the floor at her feet. Every trace of her self-satisfied smile and arrogant authority evaporated instantly. Her face turned ghost white, and her mouth opened slightly, but not a single sound or excuse came out of her throat. Kowalski took another 2 steps backward, standing rigidly at attention, with his arms dropped at his sides in profound embarrassment. Rachel covered her mouth with both hands, not in fear, but in overwhelming shock and awe at the turn of events. The standing customers who had been recording on their smartphones lowered their hands slowly, staring in complete awe at the quiet, heavy-set man standing at counter 1. The quiet dignity of Nathan Reed held every person in the room spellbound. The 2 police officers exchanged a rapid, knowing glance, and the junior officer quietly closed his official notepad and put his pen back into his pocket. Nathan looked directly at Gerald and gave a single calm nod of acknowledgement. There was no boastful smile on his broad face, nor did he utter a single word of gloating triumph. He was simply a dignified father completing a major business transaction according to plan. "Can we step into my office, Mr. Reed?" Gerald asked softly, his tone deeply respectful. Nathan looked over at Diane one last time. "If you had placed the call at 2 o'clock, Nathan said quietly, his deep voice cutting through the silent room, you would have known." The junior police officer led Rachel to the far side of the lobby, setting his official notepad open on the edge of a small customer service desk. Rachel spoke slowly and precisely, and her hands stayed completely steady as she recounted each event in careful sequence. She described the exact time Nathan had entered the branch, the specific legal documents and state identification he had provided at the counter, the moment the verification network had gone offline. Her first request to place a manual confirmation call, Diane's dismissal of that request, her second request, and the exact moment Diane had terminated the conversation and called security instead. She paused briefly before the last detail. "I knew the verification would have cleared in under 3 minutes," Rachel said, her voice flat and certain. The junior officer wrote continuously, filling half a page of tight, detailed notes without once looking up. On the far side of the lobby, the man in the trench coat walked cautiously toward the senior officer and held out his smartphone, a 47-second clip already cued on the screen. "I want to give this to you," the man said, his voice subdued with obvious guilt. "I am sorry I didn't say something sooner." The senior officer took the device, watched the clip once without expression, then passed it back and asked the man to preserve the recording. The man nodded slowly. "It's already posted on social media. I put it up about 15 minutes ago." Gerald heard that and reached into his charcoal jacket pocket. His phone was already vibrating in his hand, 3 rapid calls from the corporate headquarters number. He rejected each one and slid the phone back into his pocket without a word. Nathan still didn't know. He was standing quietly near the granite counter, one large hand resting lightly on Grace's shoulder, watching the police work through the lobby without any visible hurry or anxiety. The quiet dignity in his posture was the same it had been at the beginning of the afternoon, before any of this had started. Gerald crossed the marble floor and stopped beside Nathan. He placed his leather briefcase on the granite counter and clasped his hands together, his voice kept deliberately low. "The clip is moving fast. Corporate is already calling. The board will be on the phone within the hour." He paused. "What do you want me to do with her?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. He looked through the tall glass partition at Diane, who was sitting alone in the corner manager's office with both hands flat on her thighs, not reaching for her phone, not calling anyone, not preparing a single word of defense. She looked exactly like a person who had just realized, for the first time all afternoon, that she had made a mistake that could not be walked back. Nathan had spent the last 4 years making very quiet, very deliberate decisions. He had chosen to work from home. He had chosen to park 2 blocks away. He had chosen to stand still when Kowalski placed a hand on his back. He had chosen to say nothing when Grace's paper bag was crushed against her chest. And now he was being asked to make another choice. "Don't fire her," Nathan said finally, his voice completely even. "Not yet." Gerald looked up. Nathan kept his eyes on Diane through the glass. "I want to know how this was even possible before we decide who stays and who doesn't. If this is one person's judgment call, that's one answer. If there's something in the system that made this outcome predictable, that's a completely different problem." He turned to face Gerald directly. Three things. 1. Diane is suspended pending an independent investigation, not internal. 2. The investigation includes every branch manager who received the same KPI directives over the last 6 months. 3. The verification protocol for high-value transactions gets rewritten before this branch reopens next Monday. Gerald let out a slow, measured breath. He reached into his briefcase, removed a yellow legal pad, and uncapped his pen. Any of those are things I can start right now, Gerald said. He wasn't negotiating, he was writing them down. Nathan gave a single nod, then looked back at Grace, who had found a seat near the velvet stanchions, her blue backpack sitting squarely between her feet on the polished floor. The preliminary findings arrived faster than expected. While the police were still completing their formal incident report, Gerald's internal compliance officer sent a brief summary directly to his phone. Over the past 6 months, every branch manager in Meridian Bank's regional network had received a monthly internal KPI memo, carrying a mandatory minimum quota for flagging high-value transactions as suspicious. The directive had originated from a compliance framework implemented after a regional audit scandal the previous quarter. Diane had not invented her suspicion from nothing. She had been operating under a performance structure that, by design, rewarded caution and penalized the failure to identify risk. She was not the first manager to flag incorrectly. She was simply the first to do it in front of the man who now owned the building. Nathan read the summary in silence. He set the phone face down on the corner of the counter. Then he stepped into the corner office, the same one Diane had been sitting in all afternoon, and called his attorney. The conversation was brief. He requested that the Nathan Reed Single Parent Fund be formally established by end of week, funded at $2.5 million, with the first disbursement cycle administered directly through the Eastfield branch, starting the following Monday. When he ended the call, Nathan looked out through the tall glass panels at the main lobby. Grace had shifted in her chair. Her brown paper lunch bag, slightly crumpled and bent at one corner, was resting on her knees. Kowalski walked over from across the lobby, stopping a respectful 2 steps away from her. He didn't say much, just offered a small bottle of cold water from the customer service station. Grace looked up at the security guard for a moment, studying his face carefully the way an 8-year-old measures the sincerity of an apology that hasn't yet been spoken. Then she accepted the bottle and gave a single quiet nod. 3 weeks later, a simple piece of white printer paper reading staff training was taped to the heavy glass doors of the Eastfield branch. The bank was closed for 2 hours, but inside there were no polished PowerPoint presentations and no corporate lecterns. 11 branch employees sat in a wide egalitarian circle of rolling desk chairs arranged on the marble floor. No one was sitting behind anyone else. Nathan stood quietly in the center of the circle, wearing the same familiar faded navy polo shirt he had worn on the day of the acquisition. He didn't speak with the booming authority of a corporate owner. He spoke softly, like a father trying to explain a difficult concept. "Who here has seen something wrong happen and said nothing?" Nathan asked, his deep voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. For a long moment no one moved. Then one young teller slowly raised her hand. A moment later a loan officer raised his. Within 30 seconds, nearly every person in the circle had a hand raised. Nathan looked around the room, nodding slowly. "So have I," Nathan said. "That's why we're here." For the next 2 hours, the training didn't focus on banking protocols. It focused on a much simpler, yet far more difficult question. When you see something wrong, what do you need in order to feel safe enough to speak up? By the end of the session, every employee held a single sheet of paper containing a new direct internal reporting hotline that bypassed branch management entirely. As the circle broke up, Kowalski, who had sat quietly at the back of the group the entire time, walked over to Nathan. "I won't need anyone's permission to speak up anymore," the guard said quietly. Nathan extended his large hand and the 2 men shook on it. Before the branch reopened its doors to the public, Nathan walked over to counter 1. Rachel was standing there organizing her teller drawer exactly as she had done every day for the past 3 years. Nathan didn't invite her into the corner office, and he didn't make a public spectacle. He simply placed a single sheet of official corporate letterhead on the granite counter in front of her. It was a formal appointment notice, naming Rachel as the Eastfield branch's new internal process coordinator, a salaried position that reported directly to the new executive board rather than local management. Rachel read the document twice. She looked up at Nathan's broad, calm face, her eyes welling with unexpected emotion. "You didn't have to do this, Mr. Reed," Rachel whispered, her voice tightening. Nathan shook his head slowly, refusing to accept the gratitude. "You did the right thing knowing exactly what it might cost you," Nathan said quietly, his tone firm and serious. "This isn't a favor, Rachel. It's correct." He didn't offer any further platitudes. He didn't want her to feel indebted to him. He wanted her to understand that integrity had tangible value in the new corporate culture he was building. Rachel carefully folded the thick piece of corporate letterhead into precise thirds and tucked it safely into the pocket of her teller apron. She needed to process the reality of it on her own before sharing the news with anyone else. Nathan didn't push for conversation. He simply gave her a respectful nod and stepped back from the counter. Later that afternoon, a modest informational placard for the Nathan Reed Single Parent Fund was quietly placed in the waiting area, resting on the exact spot where the torn fragments of the $5 million check had fallen to the floor 3 weeks ago. The first recipient of the new fund was Cooper, a quiet 9-year-old boy whose single father worked as a long-haul truck driver. Because of his unpredictable shifts, the father rarely had the chance to attend his son's academic ceremonies. But today he had made it. Standing awkwardly in the bank lobby, wearing a white dress shirt with wrinkled cuffs that looked as though it had been ironed in a rush. Nathan stood deliberately in the background, keeping himself out of the spotlight. He handed a thick white envelope bearing the seal of the Nathan Reed Single Parent Fund down to Grace, offering no instructions. Grace took the heavy envelope with both of her small hands and walked carefully across the marble floor to stand directly in front of Cooper. The two children looked at each other in the quiet lobby. There were no flashing cameras, no press photographers, and no corporate banners. Nathan had specifically requested that no media be present, ensuring the moment belonged entirely to the people in the room. "Study hard," Grace said softly, holding out the envelope. "Thank you," Cooper replied, accepting it with both hands. Cooper's father turned toward Nathan, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The tired truck driver didn't say a word, but he reached out and firmly shook Nathan's large, calloused hand, a silent exchange of profound understanding between two single fathers doing everything they could for their children. Grace turned around and walked back to her father's side. She looked up at Nathan's broad face and smiled. For the first time all afternoon, Nathan smiled back, a genuine, warm smile, not a mask meant to maintain composure, but a true expression of quiet joy. If you were in Nathan's shoes, would you have handled the situation this gracefully? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. When it was time to leave, Nathan and Grace walked out through the heavy glass doors of the Meridian Bank Eastfield branch together. Stepping out onto the public sidewalk, the late afternoon sun hit them directly, casting their two long, uneven shadows onto the warm concrete. Nathan reached down and held Grace's hand, his large fingers wrapping gently around hers. They still had a 2-block walk ahead of them to reach the public parking lot where he had left the car earlier that afternoon. The walk was quiet at first, the sounds of suburban traffic humming comfortably around them. Grace kept pace with her father, her blue canvas backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulder with each step. They made it halfway down the first block when she finally spoke. She asked the question while continuing to walk, not stopping her stride and not looking up at him. "Dad," Grace said, her young voice clear and thoughtful over the ambient noise of the street. "If they hadn't found out you owned the bank, would they have apologized?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang in the warm air, taking 3 slow, deliberate steps before he spoke. "Probably not," Nathan said honestly, refusing to give his daughter a comfortable lie. He paused, looking ahead at the parking lot. "But I didn't stay in there because I own the bank, Grace. I stayed because you were watching, and I didn't want you to see me walk away just because someone else decided I didn't belong there." Grace didn't say anything in response. She simply squeezed his hand a little tighter, not out of fear, but out of a quiet, profound understanding. They reached the public lot and climbed into the faded navy Subaru Outback. Nathan turned the key in the ignition. The old engine sputtered once, coughed twice, and finally caught on the third attempt, settling into its familiar, rattling hum. Grace looked at the dashboard clock, completely unfazed. They were both used to the car's stubborn routine. He shifted into drive. Steering the car out of the lot and turning right, heading straight toward the public library exactly as they had planned at 6:15 that morning.